You wake up at 3 in the morning. Not from a nightmare, not from noise, just awake, staring at the ceiling, mind oddly clear. You check your phone, see the time, and feel a small flicker of worry. You lie there running through the usual list: stress, too much caffeine yesterday, a bad mattress, the beginning of some sleep disorder you've read about online, already calculating how tired you'll be tomorrow. Something must be wrong with you. For most of human history, this exact moment, wide awake in the middle of the night, wasn't a malfunction. It was simply what a normal night looked like. Start with the historian Roger Kirch, a professor at Virginia Tech, who spent over 15 years digging through diaries, court records, medical texts, and literature from pre-industrial Europe, looking for casual, offhand references to sleep. What he found, scattered across hundreds of documents, was a pattern so consistent it couldn't be coincidence. People referred to a first sleep and a second sleep, two distinct blocks of rest separated by an hour or more of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. This wasn't a rare condition described by a handful of unusual sleepers. It showed up constantly in French, English, and Italian sources, mentioned as casually as someone today might mention breakfast, something so ordinary nobody bothered to explain it, because everybody already understood exactly what it meant. Kirch eventually cataloged references to this two-part sleep pattern in more than 500 separate sources, spanning centuries and crossing multiple countries and languages, which is part of why he became convinced this wasn't a regional quirk or an isolated custom, but something close to the default human sleep pattern before it was quietly overwritten. Kirch found court testimony where witnesses timed events by referencing their first sleep, medical guides advising the best time to conceive a child was after first sleep, when the body was rested but not yet fully alert, and prayer manuals with specific devotions written for the waking period between the two sleeps. One 17th-century French physician even described the hour after first sleep as an ideal time for study, because the mind, rested but undistracted by the noise of the day, was believed to work with unusual clarity. Other sources describe the watch as a favored time for storytelling among households too poor to afford much candlelight, with family members lying together in the dark, still half drowsy from the first sleep, trading tales before drifting back off. English court records from the period occasionally include testimony phrased in ways that only make sense if the two-sleep pattern was common knowledge, with witnesses casually noting that a crime occurred between the sleeps, as though giving a perfectly ordinary timestamp, the way someone today might say something happened around lunchtime. That gap between the two sleeps had a name. People called it simply the watch, and it wasn't treated as a problem to fix or a symptom to worry about. It was treated as useful time. Historical records describe people using it to pray, to think over the events of the day, to talk quietly with a spouse, to tend to small chores, or simply to lie in bed in a relaxed, half-dreaming state before drifting into the second sleep. Some records even describe neighbors visiting one another during the watch, or servants using the quiet hour to slip out and meet someone, treating the gap as a small, private pocket of free time carved out of an otherwise fully scheduled day. The watch appears to have functioned as a built-in period of quiet reflection, wedged directly into the middle of the night, that the pre-industrial world simply accepted as a normal part of being human. If this sounds like folklore too convenient to be biologically real, the psychiatrist Thomas Ware ran an experiment in the early 1990s that turned it from historical curiosity into something closer to a demonstrated feature of human physiology, where it took a group of participants and placed them in an environment with 14 hours of darkness each night, roughly matching the length of a winter night before artificial lighting existed, with no clocks, no lamps, nothing to signal when asleep or wake beyond the darkness itself. For the first several nights, participants simply slept longer, as though paying down an accumulated sleep debt built up from years of shorter, artificially lit nights. But within about a month, once that initial catch-up period had passed, the participants' sleep spontaneously reorganized itself into two distinct blocks, separated by 1 to 3 hours of quiet, calm wakefulness in the middle of the night, almost exactly matching the pattern Kirch had found buried in centuries-old diaries, without Ware's participants having any knowledge of that historical research at all. What makes Ware's findings especially striking is what showed up in the participants' blood work during that waking interval. Levels of prolactin, a hormone associated with feelings of calm and relaxation, and normally elevated during restful, meditative states, spiked significantly during the gap between the two sleep phases, even though the participants were fully awake. Prolactin is the same hormone that rises during the deeply relaxed state right after orgasm, and in nursing mothers during breastfeeding, both states strongly associated with calm rather than alertness, which makes its presence during a period of wakefulness particularly telling. Their bodies weren't behaving as if something had gone wrong. They were producing a distinct, measurable hormonal signature associated with rest during a period they were technically not sleeping at all. Participants in Ware's study even described the waking interval in terms remarkably similar to the historical accounts Kirch had uncovered, a state of unusual calm, mental clarity, and quiet reflection, rather than the frustration or anxiety typically associated with modern middle-of-the-night wakefulness. The watch, in other words, wasn't simply insomnia with a polite historical name attached to it. It looked physiologically like its own dedicated state, sitting quietly between two separate phases of sleep, doing something your body seemed to specifically want it to do. So if segmented sleep is sitting this close to the surface of human biology, ready to reappear within weeks under the right lighting conditions, what actually buried it in the first place? It wasn't a gradual evolutionary shift, and it wasn't a change in diet, climate, or anything biological at all. It happened remarkably fast, within a couple of generations in most of industrializing Europe and North America, which is itself a strong clue that the cause was environmental rather than genetic. The most direct answer is artificial light, and specifically, how thoroughly it rewrote the boundary between day and night, a boundary that had shaped human sleep for as long as humans had existed. Before gaslighting spread through European cities in the early 19th century, and before Thomas Edison's incandescent bulb made electric light cheap and common by the century's end, night was genuinely dark, and darkness meant the day's activities were essentially over. Candles and oil lamps existed, but they were expensive enough and dim enough that they extended the evening only modestly rather than erasing the boundary between day and night altogether. There was little to do after sundown beyond talking, praying, or sleeping, so people simply went to bed shortly after dusk, giving them a long enough night to naturally split into two sleep phases with room for the watch in between. As artificial lighting extended the usable hours of the evening, first with gaslight illuminating city streets, and later with electric bulbs pushing that light directly into homes, bedtimes crept later and later, while wake times, tied to work schedules, and eventually to industrial shift patterns, stayed roughly fixed. The available sleep window shrank, and a shrinking window leaves no room for two separate phases with a break in the middle. The two sleeps didn't disappear because they stopped being useful. They disappeared because the night got shorter, and there was no longer enough darkness left to hold both of them. This is also why insomnia in the middle of the night can feel so specifically distressing in a way that seems disproportionate to what's actually happening. You're not just awake. You're awake inside a cultural expectation that a single, unbroken 8-hour block is the only correct shape sleep is allowed to take, an expectation that is, historically speaking, a fairly recent invention rather than a biological baseline. That expectation didn't exist for most of the people who ever lived. It's a product of roughly the last 200 years tied directly to the spread of artificial light and industrial work schedules, yet gets treated today as though it were an ancient, unchangeable law of biology rather than a fairly modern habit the body was pressured into adopting. Waking at 3 in the morning and immediately reaching for anxious thoughts about tomorrow, about being tired, about what's wrong with you, adds a layer of stress on top of a waking period your ancestors would have simply treated as a quiet hour to think, pray, or lie still in the dark. The wakefulness itself likely isn't the problem. The panic bolted on top of it, entirely absent from the historical record Kirch uncovered, maybe doing most of the damage. A 17th century farmer waking at 3 in the morning wasn't lying there calculating how ruined tomorrow would be. He was simply awake, the way the night was supposed to briefly interrupt itself, with nothing in his cultural toolkit telling him this moment meant anything had gone wrong. None of this means you should abandon consolidated sleep and try to manufacture a first sleep and second sleep on purpose. Modern life, with fixed work schedules, artificial light everywhere, and darkness that rarely stretches past 7 or 8 hours, even in winter, isn't built for the kind of long, unbroken night where his experiment required to produce the effect. Deliberately splitting your sleep in a world still running on 9-to-5 schedules and screens that mimic daylight late into the evening would likely just leave you sleep-deprived in a new and inconvenient shape, rather than restoring some lost ancestral rhythm. But the next time you wake in the middle of the night, mind unexpectedly clear, body calm, nothing obviously wrong, it's worth remembering that this specific experience has a name older than the anxiety you're layering on top of it. Your ancestors called it the watch, and for most of the time humans have existed, waking in the dark, quiet hour between two sleeps wasn't something broken in you. It was simply the shape a normal night used to take, long before there was enough light in the world to flatten it into one.